Hello there, welcome aboard Kennet. My name's Richard Williams. They call me Dicky Billy for short. My good friend Mike has already told you about the history of the boat, and I'm going to show you around the inside. But first, I should explain about the clothing that Mike and I are wearing. This is the traditional clothing of a boatman on the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. The jumper that I'm wearing is called a ganzi, and on my feet I'm wearing clogs. Additional to this, we could have had a pair of moleskin pants. Together, we call the clothing clogs and ganzi. So, now that you know how we're dressed, let's have a look round Kennet. Let's first start with the engine room. As you can see, everything in here is quite cosy. Across the back is the diesel tank. At the right hand corner is the generator, which provides 240 volts for the electric sockets. Round the corner on the right is the battery bank, which supplies the 12 volt DC for the lights. And right in front is the JP3, the 3-cylinder water-cooled Lister engine producing about 30 horsepower. Long stroke pistons, big flywheel, very economical, very reliable. This is connected to the propeller via the gearbox. This is not the original engine, that was a single cylinder from Henry Widdups at Keighley. Now that you know what makes the boat go, let me show you around the hold. From the bulkhead at the back to the bulkhead at the front cabin, this is known as the hold. In this space, the load was transported. Everything from bales of cotton, bales of wool, timber, sacks of sugar, sacks of flour, machinery, limestone chippings, coal, even night soil, in quantities of 30, 40 and possibly 50 tons. Today in the hold, we have our displays. This one here is showing the length of the canal, the route that it took and all the little villages, the towns that matured as the canal progressed. The merchants started to build from Liverpool and from Leeds, but quickly ran out of funds. Some 40 years later it was completed in 1816 and became the longest canal in Britain. 127 miles long, with 91 locks and rising to 487 feet over the Pennines. It was a huge success. Goods that were leaving Liverpool 1 ton at a time were now leaving at 40 tons a time, and cottage industries expanded to become part of the Industrial Revolution. The boats were horse-drawn. Places such as Burscough, Wigan, Shipley and Blackburn became a hive of activity with stables and warehouses. Demand for coal escalated as cotton and woolen mills developed along the canal. Crossing the Pennines was no mean feat, with 2 tunnels, Fowlridge and Gano. The exceptional sequence of locks, namely Wigan Flight and Bingley Rise, made this the M62 200 years ago. Talking of locks, let's have a look how these operate. Let's assume we're sailing into the locks and we're going upstream. You will then close the lock gates and the paddles. Now you can open the ground paddles at the top of the lock, allowing water to enter at ground level, and when the water level rises, you can open the paddles on the top gates. The average rise is about 10 feet. The average water used is 80,000 gallons. That's 2,000 bathtubs full of water, or 40,000 flushes of the toilet. That's double what you would use in your lifetime. When the lock is full, you open the gates and sail away. The 2 big dangers are getting the barge hooked up on the sill, or the barge being caught on the lock gates, especially with Kennet because of its size. The sill is the floor of the canal upstream. On the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, the locks up to Wigan are larger and can take 72 feet long barges, and the locks between Wigan and Leeds can only take a 62-foot barge. Hence Kennet is called a short boat and can travel the full distance. As you can see, the lock gates are closed at an angle, with the weight of water pressing against them, so that all the lock gates in Yorkshire point to Lancashire and all the lock gates in Lancashire point to Yorkshire. It's just a coincidence that the highest part of the canal is almost on the border between Lancashire and Yorkshire. But this is where the water supply enters the system at the highest point, from Winterburn Reservoir. One way or another, all the excess water on the Yorkshire side finishes back in the North Sea, and on the Lancashire side into the Irish Sea, recycling 200 years ago. Also remember, the whole system functioned without hydraulics or electrics. Well, this is where the bargees would come after an hard day, probably 12 hours, through the scuttle into the front cabin. There was a cast iron stove, a coal fire in one side and an oven on the other. The fire would seldom go out. It was used for boiling water and cooking and for keeping the cabin warm. A pan of rabbit stew was a favourite meal. Flour, sugar, coal would be bartered for a couple of rabbits off porches, and vegetables were available from the fields in the dead of night. 2 bedholes, one either side, and a fold-down table made it a snug accommodation. Behind the table are the storage facilities. The only facilities were a washing up bowl and a bucket for a toilet, known as a bucket and chucket.